In the spring of 1887, in the wind-blown town of Hollow Creek in the Dakota Territory, a girl of 19 stood in front of a building no one wanted and laid a single silver dollar on the auctioneer's table. The men gathered on the boardwalk laughed, because the building was a dead sheriff's office, condemned and shuttered for 11 years, and because the girl who bought it had been put out of her own father's house only 9 days before. What none of them knew, and what she did not yet know herself, was that the cell at the back of that office held a false floor, and beneath the false floor lay the proof of a theft that had broken a dozen families and made one man rich. She would find it with her hands. It would take her the better part of a season, and it would cost her more sweat than the dollar she had paid. And in the end it would set right a wrong that the whole town had agreed to forget. Her name was Della Hartwell, and she had come into Hollow Creek on the back of a freight wagon with a carpet bag, a folded quilt, and a leather roll of locksmith's tools that had belonged to a dead man who had taught her everything she knew about the way iron keeps its secrets. Stay with me through the work of it, because the work is where the truth was hidden, and a thing buried by patient hands is best uncovered by patient hands. Della had been raised in the back room of a locksmith shop in St. Joseph, Missouri, by an old German tradesman named Conrad Vetch, who was not her father and never pretended to be. Her own people had given her up at 4 to a county home, and Vetch had taken her on as an apprentice when she was 11, because she had small hands and a stillness in her that he prized above strength. The shop had been a narrow place that smelled of brass filings and lamp oil, with a bench-worn pail where 100 years of forearms had rested, and a wall of hooks from which hung skeleton keys and word blanks, and the picks he had made himself out of broken clock springs. He used to say that a lock was an honest thing, that it told the truth to anyone willing to listen with their fingers, and that the trouble with most men was that they wanted the door to open before they had earned the right. He taught her slowly the way a thing worth keeping is taught. He gave her a brass padlock the first week, and would not let her touch a pick for a month, only hold the lock and turn it and learn the small click of its honest working, so that when something was wrong she would feel the wrongness before she could name it. He taught her to file a key by candlelight, drawing the file in one direction only, testing the cut against the wards a dozen times before she trusted it. He taught her to read the inside of a mortise lock by the catch and drag of a pick, to build a picture of a thing she could not see out of nothing but the report her fingers sent up her arm. He taught her that the cheapest iron rusts loudest and the dearest iron keeps its quiet, and that a hinge will tell you its age if you know how to ask, and that a stone set in fresh mortar rings different under a knuckle than a stone set in old. He was not a gentle teacher. When she forced a pin and broke it, he made her sit with the ruined lock until she could say in plain words what she had done wrong, and only then did he hand her another. He told her that a forced lock was a lie, and a worked lock was a truth, and that she would spend her life choosing between the two in matters that had nothing to do with iron. When he died in the winter of her 18th year, coughing in the back room with the snow banked against the window, he left her the leather roll of tools in a single sentence she carried after that like a coin in her pocket. Iron remembers, he had told her, even when the men who forged it would rather it forgot. She had gone west because there was nothing in St. Joseph for a girl with a tradesman's hands and no tradesman standing, and because the railroad was selling cheap passage to the territories, and because her last living relation, an uncle by marriage named Silas Pruitt, had written to say there was a place for her in his house in Hollow Creek. The letter had been warm. The house had not been. She had arrived in the early spring to find that her uncle had remarried a hard, careful woman who counted the spoons, and that the place at the table was conditional, and that the condition was a kind of silence she could not keep. Within a week she had asked a question her uncle did not want asked, about a sum of money owed to her dead mother that had never been paid, and within 9 days she was standing on the road outside the house with her carpet-bag at her feet and the door shut behind her. A lesser girl might have wept. Della counted what she had. She had $4 and some coins. She had a trade no one in town would hire a woman to practice. She had a quilt and a carpet bag and the leather roll. And she had the auction notice she had torn from the post outside the land office, because she had read it standing in the cold and seen, among the lots, a thing that no one else in Hollow Creek wanted at any price. The old sheriff's office stood at the dead end of Latimer Street, where the town gave out into sage, and the wind came off the open ground without anything to break it. It was a squat building of local sandstone with a flat tar roof gone to seed, 2 barred windows blinded with grime, and a single iron door hung on hinges that had not turned in 11 years. The town had built it in 1869 when Hollow Creek still believed it would be a city, and the town had abandoned it in 1876 when the man who held the office, a sheriff named Amos Kell, had died in it of a fever. The doctors could not name, and no one had wanted to take the post or the building after. There were stories, the way there are always stories, about a place where a man died alone. The auctioneer, a florid man named Tobias Grange, made a joke of it when Della laid down her dollar. He said she had bought herself a tomb and a draft, and that she was welcome to both. And the men on the boardwalk laughed because it was easier than asking why a girl just put out of her uncle's house would spend $1 she plainly needed on a building she could not heat. She took the key, which was a great rust-bitten thing the size of her hand, and she walked the length of Latimer Street alone, and she did not look back at the men, because Vetch had taught her that the work answers the doubters and the mouth never does. The door fought her. She expected that. She knelt in front of it with her leather roll opened on the stone step, and she did not force the key, because forcing is how amateurs break the thing they mean to open. She worked oil into the keyway from a small tin, and she waited, and she worked the key a quarter turn and let it settle and worked it again, and on the 3rd evening of this, with the light going amber over the sage, the wards gave up their 11 years of rust, and the bolt drew back with a sound like a held breath let go. The doors swung in on a single room that smelled of dust and cold iron and the particular staleness of air that has had nowhere to go. She stood in the doorway a long moment and let her eyes adjust. There was a stove gone to flakes of rust. There was a plank desk with one drawer hanging open and empty. There was a row of pegs where a man had once hung his hat and coat, and a tin cup on the windowsill, furred gray with dust, and at the back of the room behind a low partition, the cell. It was a small cell, no more than 7 feet on a side, framed in flat iron straps and set with a door of riveted bars. The lock on the cell door was a good one, a heavy mortise piece of a make Della recognized at once, a Hartford pattern with a double-throw bolt of a kind that cost a working man a month's wage, and that recognition was the first thing in Hollow Creek that made her stop and pay close attention. A poor town did not put a dear lock on a jail it built for drunks and horse thieves. A town put a cheap padlock on a cell like that and considered itself thrifty. Someone had wanted this particular cell to hold against more than a Saturday night, and had paid for the wanting out of his own pocket. She filed that thought away with the rest of what the building was beginning to tell her, and she went to work on the cell door, and it took her a single evening because the lock had been kept oiled long after the building was abandoned, the keyway clean and dark when every other hinge in the place had seized with rust. That was the second thing that made her stop and pay attention. A man does not oil the lock of a cell. He means never to use again. She slept those first weeks on her quilt on the office floor, with the iron door barred from the inside and the wind worrying at the tar roof, and she ate bread and dried apples and what she could buy cheap, and she let the town think what it liked. In the morning she swept and mended and made the place fit to live in, and in the long evening she sat in the cell with a candle and ran her hands over the iron and the stone the way Vetch had taught her, listening with her fingers. What she did not yet know was that a man across town had heard a girl had bought the old Kell office and had set down his coffee very carefully and had begun, in the small administrative way that was the only way he knew, to be afraid. His name was Harlan Voss, and he was the president of the Hollow Creek Land and Title Company, and he was the richest man in the county, and in 1876 he had been a clerk. The cell floor was laid in flat sandstone flags, each one a hand and a half square, fitted close and worn smooth. Della had walked across it a dozen times before she felt the wrong note under her boot. It was near the back wall, the third flag from the corner, and when she stood on it, there was the faintest give, the smallest, hollow answer, a sound the other flags did not make. She knelt and pressed it with her palms and felt it rock a hair's breadth. On its bed a flag set in mortar does not rock. She knew that the way she knew her own name. She did not pry it that night. She made herself wait because Vetch had taught her that haste cracks stone and patience lifts it whole, and a thing worth hiding is worth uncovering without breaking. She spent 2 days easing the old mortar from the joints with a thin file and a length of wire, working the seam a fraction at a time, sweeping the grit away with a feather so she could see her progress, wetting the line from the tin cup so the dust would not choke the candle. The mortar came away in gray crumbs and then in flakes, and as it came, she read what it told her, which was that this flag had been lifted before and set back, by a hand that knew less of stonework than she did. The mortar around the other flags was the hard lime of 1869. The mortar around this one was a softer mix, laid in a hurry, by a man who had needed the joint to look untouched and had not had the years to let it cure. She thought of Amos Kell on his knees in this cell in the last December of his life, packing a seam with whatever he had to hand, and she worked more gently for thinking of it. On the evening of the second day she worked the blade of a flat pry bar under the edge, the worn old bar from the bottom of Vetch's roll, and she set a wooden wedge to hold what she gained, and she eased the bar and reset the wedge and eased it again the way she would have walked the pins of a lockup one at a time. She did not lever in one heave. She lifted in a dozen small honest gains, and on the last of them the flag came up out of its bed with a grinding sigh, and the smell of cold, trapped earth rose into the room. Beneath it was not earth. Beneath it was a shallow box of planking, lined with tin, the size of a large book and twice as deep, and inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark, was a bundle. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time before she touched it. The candle threw her shadow up the iron bars. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the silence in the old office was the silence of 11 years. Opening at last, she lifted the bundle out and unwrapped the oilcloth on the cell floor, and what lay inside was paper. A ledger, bound in marbled board, its corners soft with age. A sheaf of land deeds folded in thirds. A bundle of letters tied with faded string. And, tucked into the back of the ledger, a single page in a careful hand, dated the 4th of December, 1876, and signed Amos Kell, Sheriff. Della could read because Vetch had insisted on it, and she read by candlelight until the candle guttered, and then she lit another, and she read until the gray of morning came in at the barred window, and by the time the sun was up she understood why a clerk had become the richest man in the county, and why a sheriff had hidden the truth under the floor of his own jail and then died before he could use it. This is the part of the story where I ask you to sit with what she found, because she sat with it too, alone, in a cold cell, with the proof of a dozen ruined families in her lap, and she did not shout, and she did not run to anyone. She read it again to be sure. The ledger was a record of foreclosures. In the hard years of 1874 and 1875, when the wheat had failed twice and the territory was thick with families who had borrowed against their claims, the Hollow Creek Land and Title Company had held the paper on near 40 homesteads. The law of the territory required that when a loan went bad, the land be sold at public auction, openly, so that a family might be made whole on anything above the debt, and so that a neighbor might buy in fair, and the homesteader keep his dignity if not his ground. That was the law. The ledger showed what had been done instead. The deeds told it plainly. One after another, the foreclosed claims had been sold not at public auction, but by private transfer recorded in the county book at a fraction of their worth, to a string of buyers with names that meant nothing, and every one of those names the letters showed was a fiction. The buyers did not exist. The land had passed through the paper names and come to rest, clean and quiet, in the holdings of Harlan Voss, who had bought 4,000 acres of good bottomland for the cost of the unpaid debt and not a dollar more, and had turned the families off it, and had told each of them that the law was the law, and the auction had been held, and they had simply been outbid. There had been no auction. The sheriff's page in Amos Kell's careful hand said so. Kell had been the officer required by law to post the auction notices and to stand the sales, and Kell had discovered, late and to his shame, that the notices he had been handed to post were dated for sales that never occurred, and that his own name had been used on filings he had never seen. He wrote that he had confronted Voss and been offered a share and had refused it. He wrote that he feared no court in the county would move against the man who held its paper. He wrote that he had gathered the true ledger and the deeds and the letters that proved the names were false, and that he had hidden them where no man would think to look, in the one place in Hollow Creek that belonged wholly to the law and not to Harlan Voss, under the floor of his own cell. And he wrote that, if he was found dead before he could carry it to the territorial marshal in Yankton, the listener should know he had not died easy in his conscience, only easy in his bed, and that the truth was waiting to be lifted by whoever had the wit to look. He had died 11 days after he wrote it, of the fever no doctor could name. Della folded the page and sat in the cold and understood that she was holding the thing that a powerful man had spent 11 years believing was safe because the building it lay in was cursed and condemned and worth less than a single silver dollar. She wrapped the bundle again, and she did not sleep, and in the morning she did 3 things. She copied the ledger out in full in her own hand, every line, working 2 days at the plank desk until her fingers cramped, because Vetch had taught her that a single proof is a proof a powerful man can burn, and a proof in 2 places is a proof that has begun to travel. She hid the copy in the lining of her carpet bag, and she walked out into Hollow Creek and began, quietly, to learn the names of the families the ledger had ruined. The first name she sought was an old woman named Esther Cobb, who the ledger said had held 160 acres on Willow Bench until the autumn of 1875. Della found her in a tar-paper room behind the livery, taking in mending by the light of a single window, her hands knotted, her eyes still sharp. There was a basket of other people's shirts at her feet and a needle in her fingers, and she did not stop her stitching when Della came in. She did not want to talk to a stranger, and certainly not to a girl living in the Kell office, and she said as much plainly and went on with her work. Della did not argue. She set the copied page of the Willow Bench transfer on the table between them, smoothed it flat, and let the old woman read her own ruin in a hand that was not the county's. Esther Cobb's needles stopped. She read the page twice the way Della had. Then she set the shirt aside and took the page up close to the window and read it a 3rd time. And her sharp eyes filled and did not spill, because she had spent too many years learning not to. She said, in a voice gone quiet and flat, that her husband had walked out onto the open ground the winter they lost the bench, and had not walked back, and that she had been told there was an auction, and she had not been let to bid, and that for 12 years she had believed she had simply been too poor and too slow. She put her knotted hand flat on the page as if to feel whether it was warm. She asked Della where she had got it. Under the floor of the cell, Della told her. The sheriff hid it before he died. The old woman was quiet a long while. Then she said that Amos Kell had been a decent man and a coward, and that the two were not the same thing, and that she had wondered all these years why he would not look at her on the street. Now she knew. He had known the truth and lacked the nerve to carry it, and he had hidden it where a braver hand might find it, and the bravery had taken 11 years to arrive in the shape of a girl with $1. She looked at Della for a long moment, and asked what she meant to do. Della said she meant to give every family back what the paper said was theirs. She did not say it as a vow or a speech. She said it the way she would have said she meant to file a key as a plain description of work that lay ahead. Ward travels in a small town the way water finds the low ground, and within a fortnight the families who were left had begun to come to the Kell office after dark, 1 and 2 at a time, the way people come to a thing they have been taught to be ashamed of. They came with their hats in their hands and their eyes on the floor, and they did not believe her until she showed them the line that bore their own name. And then they believed her all at once and had to sit down. There was a man named Pollard who had lost a quarter section on the creek and now drove another man's freight, and who read his own name in the ledger and put his fist against his mouth and said nothing for a long while. There were the 2 Lindquist brothers, Carl and Nils, who had been boys when their father's claim was taken and were grown now and slow to hope, and who argued in low voices over whether the paper could be trusted until the older brother went quiet and said that their father had sworn to his death. There had been no auction and no one had believed him. There was a widow named Marsh and a one-armed veteran named Doolin who had lost the arm at Shiloh and had a way of looking at a thing straight on, and a Mexican family named Reyes who had farmed the South Flat for a decade and been turned off it with a paper they could not read, and had carried the shame of it as though the not reading had been the crime. Della showed each of them the line in the copied ledger that bore their name, and she lit a second candle when the first burned low, and she answered the same questions over and over in the same level voice. And she did not promise them the law, because she did not yet know whether the law in Hollow Creek. She promised them only that the truth was no longer under the floor. What she did not yet know was that Harlan Voss had not waited idly. He had sent a man named Creel, who did small, careful work for him, to make the acquaintance of the auctioneer Grange, and to learn what the girl in the Kell office had been buying at the Mercantile, and whether she had been seen carrying anything out of that building. And Creel had reported that she carried nothing out, and bought only bread and oil and candles, and that she had been seen twice at the livery talking to old Esther Cobb. And Harlan Voss, who had not been afraid for 11 years, began to be afraid again in the small administrative way that was the only way he knew, and he began to consider how a condemned building might at last be torn down for the public good. The order came from the town council, which is to say it came from Voss, who owned 3 of its 5 men. It was posted on the door of the land office and read aloud by Grange on a bright cold morning in the middle of Della's 2nd month in Hollow Creek. The old Kell office on Latimer Street, being a hazard to public safety and an offense to the dignity of the town, was condemned to be pulled down and its lot cleared on the 1st day of the following month, and the present occupant was to vacate the premises by that date or be removed. The men on the boardwalk did not laugh this time. They watched Della read the notice, and some of them, who had begun to hear the whispers, looked away. Della read it twice and folded it and put it in her pocket. She had 3 weeks. She understood exactly what the order was, because Vetch had taught her that when a man cannot reach the thing he fears, he destroys the place it lives. Voss did not know the proof was already lifted and copied. He believed that if the building came down, the cell came down with it, and the floor, and whatever the cursed sheriff might have left under it, and the whole 11-year fear would be buried under a load of broken sandstone and carted to the creek. She could have run to Yankton. Then, she had the copy. Yankton, though, was 4 days off, and the marshal there did not know her, and a girl arriving alone with a copied ledger and a wild story about a dead sheriff and the richest man in a county she had no standing in might be heard and might not, and in the meantime the building would come down, and the original proof with it, and a copy alone. Vetch's voice told her, "Is a proof, a clever lawyer turns to smoke." She needed the original to leave Hollow Creek before the building did, and she needed it to leave in a way that could not be stopped at the edge of town by a man named Creel. So she did the patient thing, which was also the daring thing, because patience and daring are not opposites in the work she had been taught. She let the town believe she was beaten. She was seen packing her carpet bag. She was seen at the freight office asking the cost of passage east, loud enough for it to be carried back. And in the dark of those 3 weeks, she did the real work. She went back to the families, and she chose among them the ones withstanding the marshal could not wave away. Esther Cobb, whose husband had died on the open ground and whose name was first in the ledger, the veteran Doolin who had lost an arm at Shiloh and could not be called a drifter or a fool, a storekeeper named Abel Tran, who had quietly held a grudge and a good name for a dozen years, and had a cousin who clerked in the territorial capital. She did not ask them to fight, She asked each of them to write down, in their own words, what had been done to them, and to sign it, and she gathered the pages, and she bound them with the copied ledger into a packet that told the whole story twice over in 9 separate hands. And then she dealt with the original. On the last moonless night before the building was to come down, Della lifted the false floor one final time. She took out the oilcloth bundle, the true ledger, and the deeds and the letters and Amos Kell's page, and she did not carry it out the front door where a man might be watching the dead end of Latimer Street. She had spent her evenings on a different kind of work, easing the iron bars of the cell's blind back window out of stone that 11 years of frost had already loosened. She had found the work, the way she found everything, with her fingers first running them along the joint between the bar ends and the sandstone sill until she felt the give. She had spent a week at it, no more than an hour a night so the change would not show by day, working oil into the old mortar and scraping it out a grain at a time, packing the gap with a paste of dust and tallow so that anyone who looked would see a barred window unchanged since 1869. By the last night, the bars lifted free in their frame as cleanly as a drawer comes out of a desk and set back without a mark. She went out the back into the sage, with the bundle against her chest under the red shawl, and she walked in the dark to the livery, where Esther Cobb was waiting with a mule and a borrowed wagon and the veteran Doolin with the reins. She gave the original bundle into Esther Cobb's hands because the old woman's name was first in the ledger, and because a thing should be carried by the one it was stolen from. And Doolin drove the old woman east, through the dark, toward Yankton with the proof under the wagon seat and the 9 signed pages beside it, while Della Hartwell walked back alone to the condemned office to be there in the morning when the men came to pull it down, so that every eye in Hollow Creek would be on the girl and the building, and not on a mule wagon 4 hours gone on the eastern road. They came at first light, a crew of 6, with picks and a span of oxen and a chain, and Grange to read the order, and Harlan Voss himself in a good coat standing well back, which was the first time in 11 years he had let himself be seen near the place. Della stood in the doorway of the office with her carpet bag at her feet and let them come. Voss watched her, and she watched him, and across the cold morning air, the two of them understood each other completely, without a word, the way a lock and the hand that has read it understand each other. He believed he was watching his fear destroyed. She knew his fear was already 4 hours east of him, and gaining. They pulled the old Kell office down in a single morning. The chain took the iron door off its hinges, and the oxen brought the front wall down in a slide of sandstone, and the men went through the rubble with their picks, and Voss came closer as they reached the back, closer than his dignity should have allowed, and watched as they lifted the cell floor flag by flag and turned up nothing but cold earth and a shallow empty box of tin-lined planking that told him too late exactly what it had once held, and that it held nothing now. Della was already gone. She had walked out of Hollow Creek in the full light of that morning with her carpet bag and her leather roll, east on the same road, and no one stopped her, because a beaten girl leaving a torn-down building is not a thing a careful man thinks to stop. The reckoning, when it came, did not come as a confrontation. It came as paper, which was fitting, because paper was the weapon the wrong had been done with. In Yankton, Esther Cobb and the veteran Doolin laid the true ledger, and the deeds, and the false name letters, and Amos Kell's signed page, and the 9 sworn accounts before the territorial marshal, a deliberate gray man named Whitcomb who had held his post through 3 governors. He read it the way Della had read it, slowly and twice turning the deeds in the light and laying them beside the letters, and he was quiet for a long time when he had finished. He asked the old woman a single question, which was whether she would swear to the truth of her own account before a judge, and Esther Cobb said that she had waited 12 years to be asked, and that she would swear to it on anything he liked. The thing about a fraud built on forged names is that it stands only so long as no one compares the names to living men. The moment the deeds were set beside the proof that the buyers had never existed, the moment a clerk in the records office was set to the patient work of trying to find a single one of them, the whole 4,000 acres came loose from Harlan Voss like rust lifting off iron. He was never met in a courtroom by any of the people he had ruined. That is not how it ended, and Della had never wanted it to. He was undone by his own filings, which the territory now examined one by one, each forged transfer a separate count, each false name a separate proof. His title to the bottomland failed. The company failed with it. He left Hollow Creek within the year quietly, in the same careful administrative way he had ruined it, and the town that had owned him let him go without a backward look, because a town will always pretend it never knew. The land went back, not all at once and not without lawyers, but it went back. Esther Cobb did not live to farm Willow Bench again, but she lived to hold the restored deed in her knotted hands, and she gave it to the Lindfist brothers, who had been boys when their father lost the next claim over, and they worked the bench and her old ground together. The Reyes family came back to the South Flat. Doolin got his quarter section and a hired hand to do what his one arm could not. Pollard left off driving another man's freight and drove his own. The widow Marsh sold her restored claim and went to her sister in Ohio with money in her pocket and her dignity restored, which the law could give back and the years could not. Della Hartwell did not take an acre of it. She had been asked by more than one grateful family to name her share, and she had said the same plain thing each time, that the land was theirs and had only been waiting to be lifted like a flag off a false floor, and that she had done the lifting, and that was all. What she took was the work. The families that had their ground back needed 100 locks and hinges and keys made and mended, and a county that had watched a girl undo its richest man with a leather roll of tools found, rather suddenly, that it could after all hire a woman to practice a trade. She did not go back to her uncle's house, and her uncle did not send for her, though the matter of her mother's unpaid money came quietly clear in the same season, settled by a man who had learned what it cost to leave a debt on the books where Della Hartwell could read it. She set up her shop in a sound stone building on a good street, and over the door she hung a sign with no words on it, only the shape of a key, because she had no use for telling the town in letters what her hands could tell it in iron. She kept Conrad Vetch's leather roll on the bench where she could reach it, the oil-dark handles worn to the shape of a dead man's grip, and now to the shape of hers. Years later, when she was an old woman herself and the territory had become a state and Hollow Creek had grown into the town, it had once only pretended it would be a young person apprenticed to her asked why she kept one tool on the bench that she never seemed to use, a flat pry bar with a worn edge kept oiled and bright among the picks and files. Della Hartwell turned it over in her hands a long moment before she answered. She said that it had lifted a stone once, in a cold cell in a building that no longer stood, and that under the stone had been the truth folded in oilcloth and waiting 11 years for a patient hand. She said that the men who buried a thing always believed the burying was the end of it, and that they were always wrong, because iron remembers and stone remembers and paper most of all. She said that a tool which has done honest work once should be kept ready and kept bright, because you never know when a floor is false. She set the bar back in its place on the bench, and she went on with the lock she was filing, and the candle burned steady, and the iron kept its quiet, and the truth she had lifted out of the cold dark, stayed lifted in the open at last where the patient hands had carried it. What would you have done, alone in a cold cell with the proof of a dozen ruined lives in your lap and $1 to your name? If a story like this one stays with you, there are others of its kind waiting, of dismissed people and the things the world threw away that turned out to hold the truth.